When we picture the Great Migration westward on the Oregon Trail, the cultural memory is usually bright and optimistic. We imagine cheerful pioneers in sunbonnets riding comfortably across pristine, sunlit prairies toward a new life. But this data visualization of the migration paints a starkly different picture. Out of the roughly 400,000 people who attempted the journey between the 1840s and 1860s, an estimated 1 in 10 never made it. As we zoom in on a representation of a single mile of that trail, the geographic reality of that mortality rate becomes clear. The route averaged 10 to 15 deaths per mile. Over a 2,000-mile journey, that equates to a grave dug every 350 feet. The primary vehicle for this migration offered no comfort. Looking at the heavy timber structure and rigid wooden wheels of a standard covered wagon, you can see these carts lacked even the most basic suspension systems. Passengers absorbed the violent impact of every single rock, rut, and hole in the earth. The constant jarring produced a condition known as wagon sickness, a brutal form of land-based seasickness that left travelers nauseous and miserable for months on end. Outside the wagon, the environment offered no relief. During dry spells, the dirt tracks turned into suffocating dust bowls that blinded travelers and choked their lungs. After heavy rains, those same trails dissolved into quagmires where wagons sank axle-deep in thick mud. Before a pioneer ever encountered a lethal threat, the baseline requirement of simply existing and moving forward on the trail was a state of constant, unavoidable physical torment. Hollywood movies often populate this harsh landscape with constant attacks by Native American tribes. In reality, indigenous groups were far more likely to act as vital allies, offering supplies, guidance, and assistance to the migrants. The actual violence of the trail was shockingly mundane. The majority of violent deaths came from unglamorous, everyday accidents. Exhausted, highly stressed travelers with zero prior experience were suddenly carrying loaded weapons every day for hunting and protection. Because of this, fatal firearm accidents were exceptionally common. The heavy equipment itself posed a constant kinetic danger. A single slip could mean having your skull crushed under a massive wooden wheel, or a panicked draft animal could easily kick a pioneer to death miles from any medical help. The geography posed the most consistent physical hazards. Crossings at the Platte, Columbia, and Snake Rivers required navigating wide, braided, unpredictable flows like the one seen here. Wagons were top-heavy cargo carts, not boats. When forced into fast-moving, turbulent river water, they easily lost their balance and violently capsized, drowning entire families and their livestock in seconds. Surviving the frontier required extreme vigilance against mechanical failures and sudden environmental traps, rather than fighting off romanticized enemies. Yet, the undisputed #1 killer on the Oregon Trail was entirely invisible: cholera. This waterborne bacterial infection thrived in the exact conditions the trail created. With thousands of travelers and their livestock clustered tightly together and drinking from the same scarce water sources, widespread contamination was inevitable. This biological timeline shows the terrifying speed of the infection. The disease caused such violent, exponential loss of fluid volume that a pioneer could wake up perfectly healthy at breakfast and be dead by dinner. In an era decades before the discovery of germ theory, the pioneers had no effective treatments. Entire wagon trains could lose dozens of people in a matter of weeks, as cholera, dysentery, and typhoid swept through the camps. The deadliest enemy on the western frontier was microscopic. All the firearms and physical strength in the world offered absolutely no defense against a contaminated cup of water. The massive physical death toll created an equally devastating psychological burden for the survivors, particularly when it came to burying the dead. Looking at these deep, permanent wagon ruts carved straight into stone, you see the physical evidence of an unstoppable forward momentum. Families who lost a child or spouse had to bury them in a shallow, unmarked grave, pack their wagon, and immediately continue walking that exact same day. There was no time for grief. This inhuman pace was driven by an environmental ticking clock. The migrants had to cross the western mountain ranges before the winter snows arrived and sealed the passes. Failing to beat that clock led to the ultimate trap. As this snow-choked mountain pass illustrates, being stranded in the high elevations meant freezing to death, or, in the desperate case of the Donner Party, resorting to cannibalism to stay alive. The combination of extreme physical exhaustion, suppressed grief, and the constant terror of the incoming winter pushed many travelers past their mental breaking point. Rates of severe depression, mental breakdown, and suicide were notably high among the migrants. Even for the fortunate fraction who survived all 2,000 miles to reach California or Oregon, the arrival was rarely a triumph. Families routinely arrived completely destitute, were severely malnourished, and carrying deep psychological trauma. The true legacy of the Oregon Trail is found in these brutal realities. It stands as a dark, awe-inspiring testament to the absolute limits of human physical endurance and psychological resilience. Imagine waking up in a typical colonial American cabin in the early 1700s. The first thing you feel is a bone-deep chill. You reach out in the darkness, touch the ice-covered wood next to you, and immediately pull your hand back. Your bed offers little relief. Underneath a thin mattress stuffed with corn husks or straw is a wooden frame strung with a lattice of ropes. Overnight, these ropes stretch, dropping your body into a sagging dip, while sharp pieces of straw poke through the rough cloth into your back. As you move, a pungent smell fills your nose. These cabin walls use wattle and daub construction, meaning the gaps between the wooden beams are sealed with a mixture of mud, straw, and animal dung. It keeps the wind out, but the scent of dried manure hangs heavy in the morning air. Stepping out of bed, your feet hit a floor of hard-packed dirt that is freezing to the touch. The fire that warmed the room has died down to glowing coals. In midwinter, every breath creates a puff of steam, and you often find a layer of ice frozen solid inside the water buckets. Survival before sunrise demanded total physical endurance. You are starting your day exhausted, cold, and sore, in an environment where every basic comfort requires a struggle. You spend your morning in the same clothes you wore yesterday. Most colonists own exactly one set of everyday work garments, made of scratchy wool or rough linen, and they wear them for weeks or even months without washing their clothes or their bodies. In the 18th century, medical consensus treats bathing as a life-threatening risk. Doctors teach that warm water opens the skin's pores, inviting lethal environmental diseases and bad air into the body. The accumulated oils and dirt on your skin are seen as a vital protective barrier against illness. This creates a world defined by the constant presence of body lice and the persistent smell of unwashed human living. Since everyone smells the same, your senses eventually treat it as background noise, until you feel the sudden, sharp bite of the body lice that live deep within your clothing seams and unwashed hair. Even if you dared to wash, the available tools are dangerous. Colonial soap is a caustic blend of rendered animal fat and lye, filtered from wood ashes. It is effective for scrubbing out grease-stained laundry, but applying it to your skin causes severe chemical burns and irritation. For the colonist, avoiding soap and water is a deliberate survival strategy. In a world without antibiotics, keeping the skin intact and the pores closed is considered the best defense against a host of invisible killers. Your priority is the hearth. Friction matches are still a century away, so you must carefully coax the overnight embers back to life. If the fire dies, you face a freezing walk to a neighbor's house to borrow live coals, as fire is your only source of heat, light, and cooked food. Breakfast is cornmeal mush, prepared in a heavy iron pot suspended directly over the flames. Handling these massive vessels is skilled, hazardous work. A slip can result in a severe burn, and without modern medicine, such injuries frequently lead to lethal infections. When you need the bathroom, you head 50 feet from the house to the privy. This is a simple wooden shed built over a deep hole in the ground. It is freezing in the winter and swarms with flies and the smell of fermentation in the summer. Liquid waste from the pit seeps horizontally into the soil. When this contaminated liquid reaches the family's drinking well, bacteria mixes into the water, creating an open path for killers like dysentery and typhoid fever to devastate a healthy family. In growing cities, families rely on heavy metal chamber pots. Every morning, these vessels are emptied directly out of upper-story windows into the unpaved streets below. Passers-by have to stay alert for the cry of "Gardy-loo," the only warning before raw sewage hits the cobblestones. From the food you eat to the water you drink, every basic survival task is compromised by a total lack of sanitary engineering, leaving the entire community vulnerable to constant outbreaks. For the men, the day is spent in the fields. Plowing means gripping a wooden handle and fighting the unyielding earth. When the blade hits a buried rock or massive tree stump, the plow jolts, sending a violent shock up your arms and shoulders. This relentless manual labor leaves the body hunched and the joints arthritic by your 30s. Your spine and hands carry the literal shape of the tools you use to survive. The work inside the home is just as exhausting. Turning raw flax or wool into a single shirt is a multi-month process. It requires harvesting, rotting the stalks in water, and beating the fibers, all before a single thread is even produced. Spinning the thread requires hours of highly rhythmic, repetitive coordination. A woman sits at a wooden wheel, using her hands and feet in a complex pattern to draw out and twist fibers. It takes thousands of yards of precisely managed thread just to begin weaving a basic garment. This bone-crushing labor was an inescapable physical tax. Every meal you ate and every piece of clothing you wore was earned through hours of manual strain that slowly broke the body down. Activity stops the moment the sun drops below the horizon. The high cost of tallow and beeswax makes candles a luxury, forcing most families to live in total darkness once the daylight fades. You rest with a body covered in the day's records, blisters, scars from the forge, and small cuts from agricultural tools. There are no modern ointments or pain relievers to ease the ache as the room cools down. Surviving here requires a fatalistic mindset. Everyone knows a minor cut can lead to blood poisoning, or a tooth infection can spread to the brain. You accept that life and death are out of your hands, a belief that helps you cope with the constant presence of tragedy. There is also the psychological weight of isolation. As the firelight dims to glowing embers, the silence of the wilderness takes over. You must maintain constant vigilance against the elements, with only your community and your own hard-won skills to protect you from the dark. This was the hardened reality of the 18th century, far from the romantic myths of quaint farm life. These survivors lived in a cycle of constant physical pain and environmental danger. Tonight, as you feel the comfort of your mattress and the security of your plumbing, recognize them as the luxuries they truly are. Let that warmth settle over you, and let the difficult rhythm of colonial history lull you to sleep. Imagine waking up in a 14th century English village. A heavy, unnatural silence has replaced the usual morning bustle. There are no children playing and no smoke rising from the blacksmith's forge. You are looking at a town where half the population has simply vanished. As you stretch, you feel the scratch of dry grass, but you aren't lying on the cold, packed earth. For the first time in your life, you're waking up on a real mattress. The grinding poverty of your childhood is gone. You have a warm wool tunic to wear and a pewter cup sitting on the table, items that used to be the exclusive mark of a wealthy merchant. This sudden comfort has a dark origin. The tools in your shed and the pot over your fire belonged to neighbors who died in a single week back in 1348. This massive loss of life resulted in an accidental redistribution of wealth. By hollowing out the population, the plague shifted the baseline of peasant life, introducing the concept of abundance to the survivors. But material wealth is a hollow prize in a world without the hands required to maintain it. A house full of inherited furniture doesn't help when the roof starts to leak, and there are no carpenters left to fix it. The plague didn't just take people, it took specialized knowledge. When the master baker died, the village lost the skill required to feed itself. His surviving apprentices produced bread so hard and dense it was practically inedible. You can see the collapse in the landscape. Weeds choked the irrigation ditches. Entire harvests rotted in the fields because there wasn't a single soul left to swing a scythe. This created a profound economic imbalance. On one side, a massive surplus of land and resources. On the other, a labor supply that had effectively been cut in half. This mismatch disrupted centuries of feudal control. In a world where workers were suddenly rare, ordinary human labor became the most valuable commodity in Europe. To understand your new power, you have to look at the manor house. Before the plague, a peasant was expected to bow and scrape, existing entirely at the mercy of their lord. But now, the manor lord is desperate. His wealth is tied to his acreage, and with no one to plow the soil, that land is worthless. He is watching his family's legacy turn back into a wilderness. So, when you approach him, you don't ask for permission. You set the terms. You offer to save his harvest, but only if he pays double and grants time off. The lord is forced to agree. Economic reality has tipped the scales, giving the worker the dominant weight in the negotiation for the first time in history. The plague proved that a lord's authority was a hollow shell if his workers refused to comply. The entire feudal hierarchy was revealed to be a system of mutual dependency, rather than absolute power. This shift wasn't isolated to one village. Across the country, the crown watched in horror as peasants gained leverage, demanding higher pay and threatening the traditional social order. In an attempt to freeze the world in place, King Edward issued the Statute of Laborers. This law made it illegal for a worker to demand more than they were paid before the plague started. The state used violence to enforce these old rates. If you asked for a raise, you could be branded with a hot iron, locked in the stocks, or even sent to the gallows. But the peasantry had already tasted a better life. They knew their own worth, and they were no longer willing to be intimidated back into the dirt. In 1381, this friction exploded into the peasants' revolt. Thousands marched on London, burning tax records and demanding an end to serfdom. What started as a dispute over daily wages had grown into the first organized massive strike against the medieval status quo. On paper, the rebellion was a failure. The leaders were executed, and the king revoked every promise of freedom he had made to the marching crowds. But look closer at the years that followed. While the crown won the battle, the peasants won the economic war. Individual lords realized that if they didn't pay competitive wages, their laborers would simply flee to a rival estate. To survive, the aristocracy was forced to ignore the king's laws and pay their workers what they were worth. The government eventually stopped trying to collect the poll taxes that sparked the fire. In a country that had lost millions, the traditional system of control had simply become impossible to enforce. The survivors demonstrated a fundamental rule. The reality of the marketplace eventually matters more than the laws written on a lord's parchment. A generation later, the landscape of England looked different. The survivors were no longer just holding on. They were building something new. We see a new working class emerging, families owning their own land, running their own shops, and deciding their own future. Literacy began to spread. The children of laborers were entering trade schools and universities, beginning a trend of social mobility that was once unthinkable. The Black Death claimed 25 million lives in Europe alone, an immense tragedy that left the survivors to navigate a hollowed-out world. But that cataclysmic loss gave ordinary people unprecedented bargaining power. By forcing the world to recognize the value of a single day's work, the survivors of the plague accidentally laid the foundations for the modern world.
Forget the Hollywood version of Victorian brothels. You aren't waking up to a scandalous, glamorous romance. It is exactly 5 a.m., the room is freezing cold, and the wind is rattling a soot-stained window. We are in London, 1857. This is a mid-level establishment in the Haymarket district. The air in your bedroom is heavy with a mixture of coal smoke from 1,000 chimneys and cheap lavender water that barely masks the dampness. Before you can even think about starting your day, you have to wash your face. You reach for the ceramic pitcher on the bedside table and have to push your fingers through a thin film of ice just to splash the water. Your path to this room is incredibly common. You weren't kidnapped off the street, and you aren't a ruined aristocrat. 2 years ago, you were a highly skilled, respectable seamstress. That respectable life required you to sew in dim light for up to 16 hours a day. In the winter, your hands were so numb that your fingers cracked and bled onto the fine white linen you were stitching. This chart breaks down the impossible math of that life. The average weekly wage for a seamstress falls entirely short of the absolute minimum cost for basic rent and food in London. No matter how many hours you worked, the deficit was permanent. When you look at those numbers, entering the Haymarket brothel makes perfect sense. It is a calculated economic decision to put a roof over your head and keep yourself from starving in the streets. And keeping that roof over your head requires following a strict daily schedule. The madam runs a tight ship, and your mornings are dedicated entirely to manual labor.
At breakfast, the women don't sit around discussing their evening encounters. The conversation sounds like any other Victorian household. You talk about the rain, complain about the baker, and share rumors about the local butcher. After eating, you spend hours dusting and polishing the main parlor. The heavy red velvet curtains and polished wood are carefully chosen to project an image of middle-class respectability to the clients who walk through the door. Then comes the laundry. You lean over a massive copper tub, using harsh, skin-burning soap to scrub and wring out heavy cotton chemises by hand until your arms ache. By noon, you are exhausted. Maintaining the physical illusion of a pristine, high-class home requires far more energy than anything you do once the sun goes down. The rhythm shifts completely on Wednesday afternoons. A physician arrives at the house, and every worker lines up for a mandatory medical examination. The doctor works through his examinations with practiced detachment. He is looking for the earliest signs of venereal disease, which is a constant and terrifying hazard of the job. The madam enforces this rule strictly. Anyone showing symptoms is immediately removed from work. It is an expensive precaution, but keeping the staff healthy is the only way to protect the long-term profits of the house. When evening falls, the real work begins, and it starts long before you reach the bedroom. Greeting your first client requires an exhausting, highly scripted psychological performance. You pour him a glass of sherry and settle into a chair to listen. Many of these men are simply looking for an attentive companion, so you sit and nod enthusiastically while a bank clerk talks at length about his stamp collection. The physical act that follows is treated as a detached, practiced routine. It is a timed task that you execute efficiently so you can quickly wash up and prepare for the next visitor. Surviving the night shift in a mid-level brothel demands immense emotional endurance. You are paid to validate these men, and that mental performance drains you far more than the physical act itself. Long past midnight, the final client leaves, and the house falls quiet. Your muscles ache as you finally climb the stairs to the small room you share with another worker. Here, the grand illusion drops completely. You unlace your tight corset, pull out heavy artificial hairpieces, and scrub away the thick layers of cheap cosmetics. As you prepare for bed, you and your roommate quietly tally your earnings for the day. There is no weeping and no romanticizing the situation, just a pragmatic assessment of cash. Because no matter how tedious or degrading the work gets, the alternative is waiting just outside the front door. You have regular, warm meals and a solid roof, while thousands of others face absolute destitution in the freezing alleys. In a society that legally barred women from most paths to wealth, this environment offered working-class women a reliable income and a very specific, highly constrained form of economic independence. The most sensationalized profession in Victorian history was, in reality, a cycle of grueling domestic labor and exhausting social performance. These were ordinary women doing exactly what they had to do to survive another day.
Adjust your pillows. Pull that blanket up a little higher. Enjoy the reliable warmth of your modern bedroom, because we are leaving it behind. It's 1883, in the absolute isolation of the Montana frontier, and the wind outside is screaming. Inside the cabin, the temperature has plummeted to 40 degrees below zero. Every exhale forms a tiny, suspended cloud of ice crystals in the pitch-black air. If you were to swing your legs out of bed, your bare feet would strike plank floorboards that feel indistinguishable from solid ice. Across the room sits the only thing keeping your family alive. Inside the cast-iron stove, yesterday's fire has faded into a few fragile, glowing embers. If those embers die, the temperature inside will match the deadly freeze outside. Your father moves through the darkness. He carefully arranges small, bone-dry splinters of pine over the remaining heat. He works with absolute precision. Adding too much wood too quickly will smother the delicate flames, and dropping too little will let them starve. The rest of the family remains buried under piles of heavy quilts, motionless. Everyone is paralyzed by the cold, holding their breath, waiting to hear the sharp crackle of pine catching fire. Until that sound comes, nobody moves.
Surviving a frontier winter is an active, ongoing battle. It is a relentless ticking clock, where every hour of human existence depends entirely on the meticulous maintenance of that small flame. Getting a morning drink of water requires stepping directly into that killing cold. Someone has to carry a wooden scoop out into the snow, dig past the top layer to find clean powder, and carry it back inside just to melt over the stove. Before opening the door, exposed skin is smeared with a protective layer of bear grease and beeswax to prevent it from cracking open. Hands are shoved into leather mittens, which are then covered by thick wool socks to create a crude, layered barrier against immediate frostbite. Harvesting fuel demands hours of exhausting labor in the deep snow. You use meticulously filed iron wedges and heavily oiled axes to fell trees and split logs, all while your fingers go dangerously numb. You have to select the wood strategically. Pine splits easily and burns hot to quickly raise the cabin's temperature in the morning. Dense oak requires far more effort to process, but it produces a slow, steady burn needed to carry the heat through the long, dark nights. Every swing of the axe is a strict metabolic transaction. Every calorie of energy you burn shivering in the snow has to be mathematically justified by the amount of heat that wood will eventually produce inside the stove. When a true blizzard hits, the winds can reach whiteout conditions in minutes. All outdoor work stops instantly. The family retreats indoors, entirely dependent on the structural defenses they built before the first freeze. Between those massive wooden logs sits a thick sealant called chinking. This specific mixture combines river clay for bulk, wood ash for fire resistance, and clumps of animal hair acting as a fibrous binder to hold the mud together even when the temperature drops below freezing. Inside, old newspapers were pasted onto the inner walls. This thin layer blocks microdrafts and reflects radiant heat back. Outside, survival involves shoveling dense snow against the walls. Packing the snow insulates the crawl space and forces freezing wind entirely around the structure. The frontier cabin is a highly engineered, multi-layered thermal engine. Every gap is sealed, and every surface is optimized to trap every ounce of energy. As night falls, the blizzard intensifies. The temperature plummets so far that frost begins creeping up the inside of the walls. The cabin's outer thermal defenses are starting to fail. The family immediately initiates an extreme emergency protocol. They drag the heavy wooden dining table directly next to the stove and drape thick quilts over the top and sides, creating a tiny, contained room within the room. Crawling into this space, the family huddles shoulder to shoulder on the floor. It is cramped and claustrophobic, but by trapping their combined physical body heat under the heavy fabric, they create a microclimate that stays 20 degrees warmer than the rest of the cabin. Sleeping through the night is impossible. The adults split the darkness into rigid 2-hour shifts. One person must stay awake at all times to monitor the sleepers for early signs of hypothermia, and crucially, to manage the fire. Every 30 minutes, the person on watch opens the stove door and adds exactly 2 logs. No more, no less. This precise arithmetic ensures the coal bed survives until dawn without burning through their dangerously low supply of indoor wood. Finally, the howling wind stops. Morning light filters through the frosted windows. The careful arithmetic, the layered clothing, the engineered walls, their passed-down knowledge kept them alive through the darkness. Tonight, you don't have to calculate your firewood or build a shelter under your table. You can simply tap a thermostat on your wall and command the temperature to rise. Take a deep breath of that warm, effortless air and let yourself drift off to sleep, safe from the cold.
When we think of wealthy Victorian society, we picture the absolute peak of refinement. We imagine grand estates, exquisite fashions, and pristine manners. This obsession with purity was a survival mechanism. The streets of 19th century London were choking on industrial smog and raw sewage. To escape, the elite built literal fortresses to seal out the miasmas of the outside world. But building an airtight sanctuary requires new technology. These families eagerly embraced the cutting edge of the Industrial Revolution, packing their homes with experimental chemicals and untested infrastructure. The wealthy Victorian home was an architectural death trap, hiding lethal hazards in plain sight. By striving for aesthetic perfection and absolute isolation, they unknowingly locked themselves inside beautifully decorated gas chambers. Let's step into the drawing room. Every inch of these spaces was draped in heavy fabrics and covered in richly patterned, vibrant wallpapers. This diagram shows the cross-section of the era's most coveted color, Paris green. Achieving this brilliant hue required mixing crystalline arsenic directly into the pigment. When warmed by a fireplace, the wallpaper actively shed toxic vapor into the lungs of anyone nearby. The physical toll was brutal. Families suffered from chronic nausea and debilitating headaches that doctors couldn't diagnose, often ending in agonizing deaths. The danger extended far beyond the walls. Those same vivid dyes saturated women's dresses, while the popular taxidermy birds perched on the mantelpiece were preserved using highly toxic mercuric chloride. Their relentless demand for vibrant manufactured beauty turned the walls of their private sanctuaries into weapons. Moving into the dim hallways, we find another massive domestic convenience: indoor gas lighting. For the wealthy, flipping a valve to summon light felt like magic, but these early gas fixtures were notoriously faulty. They frequently leaked odorless carbon monoxide into the enclosed corridors, quietly asphyxiating entire families as they slept. Then there was the ultimate status symbol of Victorian hygiene, the indoor water closet. Look at this early plumbing schematic. A straight vertical pipe drops directly from the toilet to the city sewer, lacking a curved S-trap. Without this water barrier, highly flammable methane gas drifted straight up from the sewers, pooling inside the bathroom, risking violent explosion. By adopting experimental infrastructure before understanding the physics behind it, the upper classes invited suffocating fumes and explosive threats directly into their homes. The most tragic room in the house is the nursery, a space theoretically dedicated entirely to the innocence and safety of children. The bright red and green paints coating these beautiful toys, the porcelain dolls and the wooden rocking horses, were heavily laden with lead. Lead has a naturally sweet taste. Children who instinctively explore the world by putting things in their mouths chewed on these toys daily, suffering irreversible neurological damage as a result. When children fell ill, parents turned to medicine cabinets filled with highly addictive chemicals masquerading as cures. Soothing syrups given to infants for teething pain were essentially liquid morphine, sitting right next to bottles of chloral hydrate and laudanum. The primal instinct to nurture and heal was corrupted by a predatory, unregulated pharmaceutical market that packaged lethal narcotics as everyday remedies. The Victorians spent vast fortunes building impenetrable fortresses to keep the deadly streets at bay. They never realized they were steadily poisoning themselves from the inside out. Today, it's easy to complain about tedious building codes, strict FDA regulations, and miles of bureaucratic red tape. But our modern baseline of safety, the mandatory S-traps in our plumbing, the strictly enforced lead-free paint, and the carbon monoxide detectors in our hallways, exists as a direct response to these specific tragedies. These seemingly boring consumer protection rules are quite literally written in blood. They were paid for by the victims of early, unchecked industrialization. The Victorian home stands as historical proof that technological progress, without stringent protection, will inevitably turn our safest sanctuaries into our greatest threats. The 1950s Soviet Cold War begins in a dim room, barely larger than a walk-in closet. Forget the slick spies of the cinema. The real battleground is a lumpy mattress and a freezing morning. It is 1953 in Leningrad. Joseph Stalin has just died, but his portrait still hangs in the hallways of these communal apartments, casting a long shadow over the millions of citizens waking up beneath his gaze. 4 family members share a single room, measuring 150 square feet. This is your entire world, the place you sleep, eat, and store every possession you own. The central heating is failing, and your breath clouds in the air before you even stand up. The first mission of your day is a physical negotiation. You have to find enough floor space to put on your boots without stepping on your sleeping parents or knocking over the wash basin.
Outside your door, a single dark corridor connects 8 different families. Over 30 people are forced to share one bathroom and one toilet. Every family follows a strict 15-minute schedule. Access to the sink is a high-stakes timing exercise. If you miss your window, you may spend the next hour in the hallway, listening to the pipes groan while your neighbors wash. A delay here cascades through the morning. If the bathroom line stalls, you arrive late to the factory, a violation of labor discipline that the state tracks and punishes with docked pay or worse. This architecture forces a constant mutual surveillance. Privacy disappears when your entire survival depends on knowing exactly when your neighbor finishes their morning routine. Breakfast is earned through raw endurance. Family members rotate shifts to stand in bread lines that form in the dark well before the bakeries open their doors to the freezing city. In the shared kitchen, several families jockey for space on a single stove. To avoid the friction, mothers brew tea on small, technically illegal electric hot plates tucked away in the corners of their private rooms. Leaving the block means descending 5 flights of stairs past an elevator that hasn't moved in decades. The air in the stairwell smells of boiled cabbage and the haze of cheap, unfiltered tobacco. Leningrad's wet cold follows you onto the tram. Dozens of workers press together in a damp, silent huddle as the trolleybus rattles toward the industrial district. Through the fogged windows, you see the state's vision for the future. Bright posters show muscular workers marching toward a socialist paradise, a sharp contrast to the silent exhaustion inside the tram. This journey reinforces your role in the system. You are one silent gear in a state machine that prioritizes industrial movement over your personal comfort. The gates of the Kirov Works swallow thousands of workers every morning. Inside, the screech of industrial lathes replaces the silence of the commute. For 8 hours, you repeat the same mechanical motions. You turn raw metal into tractor components, piece by piece, while the clock on the wall tracks your output against the shift schedule. Central planners in Moscow set the official plan, dictating quotas that often ignore the reality of broken equipment or missing materials on the floor. Survival requires a second set of rules. You learn to pace yourself, slowing the machines when the supervisor leaves, and conserving your energy for the walk home. Informal networks fill the gaps left by the state. If a machine breaks, you don't file a report. You find the colleague who has spent years hoarding the specific bolts you need. These unofficial compromises kept the economy running. The system functioned because millions of people found ways to circumvent the impossible demands of the plan. The factory horn signals the end of the shift. It is the cue to begin the journey back across the city through the evening drizzle. You rejoin the dense crowds on the sidewalk, retracing your steps through cabbage-scented hallways to wait at the stove once again. Lying down in your 15 square feet, the loop resets. Tomorrow morning, the bathroom line and the bread line will be waiting in the dark. The Soviet superpower was forged in these thousands of daily repetitions. The state's industrial goals were met through the raw endurance of a workforce that had no other choice. Meaning was found in the shared silence of the tram and the networks of support that kept the lights on. This was a society held together by mutual reliance and a quiet, persistent preservation of the self. Many people picture the 19th century mountain explorer as a lone rider gazing over a pristine valley, taking in majestic vistas. The morning reality usually involved waking up on a thin layer of sharp pine needles and frozen earth, with a single wool blanket for bedding. If the temperature hit 20 below, your muscles would clench with a bone-deep chill. The damp, unwashed buckskin clothing against your skin often froze overnight, crunching like dry leaves when you tried to stand. Survival on the frontier was a monotonous, daily condition of fending off nature's indifference. There are no slow starts to the day. You leave the meager warmth of a dying campfire before dawn to begin the chores required for your basic needs. Often, the first task is wading waist-deep into a swollen river fed by freezing spring snowmelt. The current hits with enough force to knock you off your feet as you reach for the trap lines. Every day, you sacrifice warmth and comfort because a failure to check those traps means losing the catch to scavengers, leading directly to a failed season or starvation. The driver for all this misery was a flat-tailed rodent. Because East Coast fashion demanded beaver fur hats, These pelts became the only currency that made the wilderness profitable. Securing that currency requires heavy, forged iron traps with a powerful spring mechanism to snap these steel jaws shut. The trap must be staked and secured by this heavy metal chain, or a trapped beaver will simply drag the expensive equipment into deep water. To bait the trap, you use castoreum, a pungent, musky paste harvested from the beaver's own glands and mixed with whiskey and spices. The smell is sharp and offensive, but to a beaver, it is an irresistible lure. Harvesting the animal is a bloody, unsentimental job. You pull the beaver from the trap and skin it immediately, pulling the hide off like a heavy, wet sock. The entire frontier economy rested on this foundation of exhausting, repulsive manual labor. In this environment, imported cotton is a death sentence. It absorbs moisture and drains body heat, making locally processed buckskin a physical necessity for survival. Creating that buckskin involves brain tanning, a process built on the fact that an animal typically possesses just enough brain matter to tan its own hide. This works because the lipids and oils in the brain tissue penetrate the dense collagen fibers of the hide. This biological interaction breaks down the rigid structure, turning a stiff skin into soft, supple leather. The labor is grueling. You mash the brains into a gray paste, rub it into the hide, and then spend hours aggressively stretching the skin over a lock without rest until it dries. Finally, you smoke the hide over a smoldering fire. This coats the fibers to prevent them from stiffening when wet, locking in a permanent scent of wood smoke and animal matter. Merely keeping the wind off your back required literal days of foul-smelling, back-breaking chemical processing. Evening chores shatter any illusion of relaxing around a campfire. You must prepare for winter by drying thin strips of meat in the sun and wind. This process eliminates the moisture that causes spoilage, turning the meat into brittle, blackened leather. You then use heavy rocks to pound these dried strips into a coarse powder, a repetitive task that leaves your shoulders and arms throbbing. Finally, you render animal fat over a slow fire, strain it, and mix it with the meat powder and dried berries to form dense, greasy cakes. This is pemmican. It is a repulsive but highly caloric fuel that resists spoilage for years, serving as the primary barrier between a mountain man and winter starvation. By the time you crawl into a makeshift lean-to, your body is a catalog of stiffness. You smell of smoke, beaver musk, and rendered fat. This massive stack of processed pelts represents months of freezing wades and agonizing labor. Survival in this wilderness hinges entirely on following its harsh rhythms and submitting to its repetitive, unforgiving systems. The reality of this life bears little resemblance to the loud, gunslinging cowboys of Hollywood fiction. Making it through to tomorrow required an immense capacity for enduring daily, agonizing discomfort. As you sink into your own mattress tonight, you can appreciate the miracle of central heating and a world where survival no longer requires this grueling grind. When you wake up in the pitch-black, soot-stained Victorian morning, the exhaustion is already bone-deep. You are lying on a straw mattress, shivering in a room that smells of coal dust and unwashed bodies, and every muscle in your back aches from the 16 hours of labor you finished just a few hours ago. The 19th century calendar offers no mercy. There are no weekends, no scheduled vacations, and absolutely no time to recover. If you are breathing, you are expected at your station. This was the cold reality of the early Industrial Revolution. As steam engines and iron gears rapidly multiplied across the landscape, the new economic order required a massive, constant input of fuel to stay profitable. That fuel was cheap, expendable human labor. Before the sun even rises, thousands of people, including children as young as 8, trudge through polluted streets toward the looming mill. The first thing that hits you is the noise. Hundreds of cast iron power looms and spinning frames clatter simultaneously, creating a rhythmic, concussive pounding that rattles your very bones. This machinery operates at such a high volume that verbal communication is impossible. If a worker is trapped, their only hope is a frantic hand signal. Their screams are swallowed instantly by the scale of the factory floor. These early machines are entirely unregulated. Massive gears and fast-moving leather transmission belts spin at high speeds without a single safety guard or shield. Every movement requires absolute precision. A single second of lost focus or a loose sleeve snagged in a drive belt results in a crushed limb or dismemberment. The most hazardous tasks are often reserved for children. Because of their size, they are forced to crawl directly underneath these active moving mechanisms to sweep up cotton dust, inches away from the iron teeth that could kill them. Human safety is irrelevant in this ecosystem. The continuous operation of the machine is the only priority, as the mill owners view a broken worker as nothing more than a part that needs to be replaced. By midday, profound physical and mental numbness sets in. You have been standing for 8 hours with barely a pause for food, and your mind begins to wander, which is exactly when the machines are most dangerous. But the gears aren't the only threat. There is an invisible killer in the room that every worker is forced to invite in. Because windows are nailed shut for humidity, the air is thick with cotton dust. These jagged fibers enter the lungs with every breath, physically scarring the tissue. This leads to a chronic, suffocating condition, a respiratory destruction as certain as miner's black lung. The dim, flickering gaslighting adds to the toll, forcing you to squint at fine threats for 16 hours until your eyesight is permanently blurred. The quota system removes any remaining autonomy. The machine's engine determines the pace of your life, and any failure to keep up with its relentless speed results in a loss of pay. This shift is a slow, systematic consumption of the worker's physical health, traded away 1 hour at a time for the sake of the machine's output. Night has fallen again by the time the whistle blows. The workers stumble back out into the freezing streets, exactly as they left 16 hours ago. Their muscles tremble, their lungs burn with the cold, and their bodies are entirely depleted. This routine leaves an entire generation permanently broken. By the age of 30, the average industrial worker is often hunched and arthritic, their body used until it is no longer functional. The wealth generated by this labor didn't stay in the slums. It flowed into ornate parlors, funding the cheap, abundant luxury goods that defined the lives of the wealthy classes. The success of this system established a new, mechanical logic for labor. It proved that human life could be managed with the exact same cold, calculated efficiency as a steam engine, a philosophy that would later underpin the extraction of the American frontier and the crushing industrial quotas of the 20th century. The modern labor rights we enjoy today, the 8-hour workday, the weekend, and workplace safety laws, were not gifts from industry. They were paid for by the broken bodies of these men, women, and children. Our modern ease was built on the foundation of their invisible sacrifice. It is a debt we carry every time the rhythmic hum of the factory fades into the background of history. If you close your eyes and picture the American gold rush, you probably see a lone, rugged prospector kneeling by a pristine river, striking it rich overnight by pulling a piece of gold the size of a fist from the water. That image is the result of a massive 19th century propaganda campaign. Newspapers and corporate promoters blanketed the East Coast with stories of ordinary men finding nuggets the size of chicken eggs, drawing hundreds of thousands of people westward. Most migrants arrived to find a labor system where the risks were borne entirely by the worker, while the potential for profit was strictly controlled by those who owned the land and the supplies. To understand how this system functioned, we have to look at the exact spatial blueprint of the settlements they lived in. The geography of the boomtown itself reveals exactly how wealth was extracted from the workers. The California gold rush functioned as a highly efficient, multi-layered machine. It utilized the physical labor of the working class to systematically funnel wealth upward to a specific group of merchants and business owners. The lowest layer of this ecosystem was the claim itself. Searching for loose gold in streams, known as placer mining, required hours of grueling physical exertion in ice-cold mountain water. Men spent 12 hours a day bent over freezing runoff, sifting sediment through massive wooden sluice boxes. This repetitive labor took an immediate toll. Miners became hunched and arthritic by their 30s, their hands cracking from the constant friction of cold water and sharp rock. If a miner moved away from the rivers to chase veins of ore underground, known as hard rock mining, the dangers multiplied. There was a complete absence of safety protocols or engineering oversight in these early shafts. Men tunneled into unstable rock, exposing themselves to odorless carbon monoxide gas, premature dynamite detonations, and catastrophic rockfalls that crushed crews where they stood. The physical extraction process often destroyed a miner's health through repetitive trauma and exposure, long before they ever had a chance to bring their gold into town. Moving inward, laborers returned to the settlement. These towns were haphazard collections of structures, populated almost entirely by young, single, stressed men. Infrastructure was non-existent. The streets were unpaved dirt tracks that transformed into mud pits composed of garbage and accumulated human and animal waste. These unsanitary conditions became vectors for disease. Without a proper sewage system, waterborne illnesses like cholera and typhoid spread rapidly through the community. The mining industry itself introduced secondary biological killers. Men constantly inhaled fine rock dust, developing an agonizing disease called silicosis. Those processing gold handled liquid mercury, absorbing toxins causing neurological damage, tremors. Reaching the settlement provided no refuge. It merely concentrated already weakened miners inside a biological kill zone. If a miner survived the physical trauma of the claim and the biological hazards of the camp, they faced the final layer of the boomtown. The average independent laborer earned a meager subsistence wage of $2 to $3 for a 12-hour day. Here is the extreme price inflation of basic goods in a mining camp compared to markets back east. Because transportation was difficult, local merchants inflated costs. A simple can of peaches could cost the equivalent of 20 modern dollars, instantly evaporating a miner's daily wage. The financial winners of the gold rush were the people stocking those shelves. Store owners and saloon keepers held a monopoly on survival necessities. Regulated banking was non-existent. Local stores and unregulated banks forced miners to trade physical gold dust for supplies at exchange rates far below market value. The boomtown economy functioned as a massive funnel. The system ensured that whatever wealth a laborer pulled from the earth was immediately transferred into the pockets of the local business owners. By the 1870s, the easily accessible surface gold was gone. The independent prospector was replaced by large-scale corporate development. Well-funded mining conglomerates utilized industrial tools to extract wealth. High-pressure water cannons washed away entire cliffsides, while the laborers who operated them remained disposable parts of the process. Injured miners had zero access to safety regulations or disability support. A serious injury ended a career instantly, while the wealth they extracted flowed out of the camps to build opulent banks back east. Ordinary people performed the dangerous labor of extraction to enrich distant investors, establishing a model of industrial mining where the worker was treated as a disposable resource. Modern depictions of a 19th century winter tend to soften the edges. We see a grand Victorian house under a blanket of snow and imagine a season defined by roaring fires and the quiet comfort of a stone manor. But removing the layer of modern heating reveals a baseline reality that was far more grueling. Staying warm wasn't a background convenience. It was a manual, 24-hour struggle against temperatures that the human body isn't built to withstand for long. At 19th century bedroom was often indistinguishable from the world outside. Water barrels stored in the kitchen frequently froze solid, and thick layers of frost didn't just cover the windows, they formed on the inside of the glass. If the fire had died out completely overnight, the structural materials of the house would begin to dump their stored heat. Once that thermal baseline was lost, it could take a full day of constant burning just to make the living space tolerable again. Every winter morning began with a race. You had to generate a massive amount of heat quickly, or the cold would settle into the walls and floors, turning the home into a space that functioned more like a walk-in freezer. In wealthier homes, this race was fueled by servant labor. Housemaids rose in the dark to carry coal scuttles weighing 30 pounds up multiple flights of stairs. They hauled dozens of these buckets each morning, working in the cold to start the fires that the family expected to be burning before they woke. On the frontier, the physical toll hit you immediately. You had to climb out of bed and pull on layers of wool that were still freezing from the night before. This clothing was often unwashed and abrasive, providing protection at the cost of constant physical irritation. The most demanding task was kneeling before the hearth to find a few glowing embers buried in the ash. You had to be inches away from the cold stone, carefully feeding small scraps of wood to a heat source barely clinging to life. Smothering those embers with too much wood or poor airflow meant starting from scratch. In a house that was already below freezing, those lost hours meant the most vulnerable members of the family, the children and the elderly, would struggle to maintain their body heat as the day wore on. Simply existing required you to burn a staggering amount of human energy and physical calories before the sun was even fully up. To make this process efficient, families relied on a precise, multi-stage method for managing heat, a set of techniques refined through generations of trial and error. This diagram of a standard fire lay shows why the order of materials mattered. It starts with bone-dry, resinous pine. Pine contains flammable sap that catches instantly, providing the initial burst of heat to create a chimney draft. Once established, heavy oak logs were added. Oak's slow, steady burn sustained output, keeping the house warm without constant tending. If the wood was even slightly damp or positioned too closely together, it choked the oxygen flow. The fire would smolder and die, forcing you to start the grueling process over in a room getting colder by the minute.
Managing a hearth wasn't just a chore. It required understanding green patterns, gauging moisture levels, and maintaining proper airflow. It was a skill that had to be executed perfectly to keep the cold at bay. While wealthy manors looked impressive, they were often damp and poorly ventilated. Their cellars were notorious for breeding black mold, causing chronic respiratory issues that doctors at the time often failed to diagnose. On the frontier, the home was a literal barrier against the wind. The gaps between the logs were sealed with a hand-mixed material called chinking, stopping sub-zero drafts from cutting through the living space. This cross-section shows chinking was a mixture of available materials. Clay provided bulk, ash added fire resistance, and animal hair prevented cracking. Inside, a second wall created a 4-inch dead air space, stuffed with hand-harvested moss for thick insulation to stabilize temperatures. These frontier houses weren't just simple shelters. They were structures that required hundreds of hours of manual labor to build and maintain, specifically designed to function as a shield against the elements. The constant cycle of freezing and thawing took a heavy toll on the body. Many suffered from chilblains, a painful condition where the small blood vessels in the hands and feet become inflamed, leading to swelling and skin sores. When the sun went down, the danger intensified. Temperatures could drop to 40 below zero, and a blizzard could bury the house, making even a short trip to the woodpile an ordeal. To stay warm through the night, families used stones they had collected from creeks during the summer. These were heated by the stove all day, wrapped in thick rags, and placed at the foot of the bed to provide a few hours of localized heat. They also used a specific night fire layout. They would use large logs and bury them under a layer of ash. This technique slowed down the combustion, ensuring that there would still be hot coals waiting to restart the fire the next morning. The arrival of darkness meant the end of the day's work, but it was also the most critical test of everything the family had prepared. During the most extreme cold snaps, families would abandon their beds and sleep together on the floor. By clustering under every blanket they owned, they focused their body heat into a small space, trapping every bit of energy to stay above freezing. This required a strict rotation of sleepers. One adult would remain awake at all times to manage the fireplace dampers and physically check the children to ensure they weren't slipping into the first stages of hypothermia. If the person on watch fell asleep, the fire would die out. In 40 below weather, that mistake could leave the entire family unable to wake up the next morning. Historical winter survival was a disciplined, relentless struggle. Modern heating isn't just a convenience. It's a hard-won victory over a threat that once defined every hour of human existence. When imagining the construction of the Great Pyramid, the mind often goes to the cinematic version,
We see a blistering desert sun, thousands of exhausted prisoners, and the tension of an overseer's whip driving them to exhaustion. The archaeological record tells a different story. There were no whips, and the people hauling the stones were free citizens. To see how the pyramids actually rose from the sand, imagine yourself as an ordinary, free citizen farmer living in ancient Egypt around 2500 BCE. Every year, the Nile River flooded, leaving agricultural fields underwater for months. With farming paused, the state conscripted young men under a system called the corvée labor tax. You owed the government physical labor on public works during the flood season. A massive, heavily organized, and relentless bureaucratic grind drove the construction of the pyramids. Your day starts at dawn inside the Giza barracks. You wake up to the claustrophobic stench of animal dung, wood smoke, and the smell of thousands of unwashed men sleeping shoulder to shoulder. This wall painting shows how the state compensated your service. Daily rations consisted of 2 staples, ash-baked bread and a thick, gritty beer. You can see the industrial scale of the food preparation here. State kitchens processed these dense batches to maximize caloric intake. This highly concentrated fuel kept the biological engine of the workforce moving. Once you're fed, you march to the worksite. You belong to a crew organized into specific gangs with names like the Friends of Khufu. Your gang is assigned to a solid limestone block. Each of these rough-hewn stones weighs approximately 2.5 tons. Egyptians moved these blocks on wooden sledges. A worker pours water onto the sand, reducing friction. For 14 hours, your gang repeats a loop. Pull the rope, step forward, pour water. You drag the block inch by agonizing inch. From your perspective on the ground, building the monument is an agonizing battle against friction in the desert sun. A work site in 2500 BCE lacks safety protocols. The results are devastating. Workers routinely suffered crushed fingers, they endured snapped bones, and amputations by shifting stones. We have physical evidence of this labor. When archaeologists excavated the workers' graveyards at the base of the pyramids, they found the remains of the men who hauled the stones. The skeletons reveal severe physical damage. Researchers found compressed lower spines and extreme osteoarthritis in the joints of workers barely 30 years old. The Great Pyramid rose through the permanent destruction of the workers' own joints and spines. When the 14-hour shift ends, you drag your battered body back to the barracks and collapse onto a reed mat. In a few hours, the sun will rise, and the routine starts again. Despite being treated as biological machinery, these workers were respected members of Egyptian society. A worker who died on the job earned the honor of a burial plot in the direct shadow of the pharaoh's monument, complete with provisions for the afterlife. This psychological motivation made the pain bearable. Workers believed their exhaustion and injuries were contributing to a divine national project. The Great Pyramid documents the staggering capacity of human endurance and the reality of the blue-collar grind. You open your eyes. The first thing you register is the rough, scratchy stems of a woven grass mat digging into your back. It is 25,000 years ago, deep in the grip of the last ice age, and the ambient air inside your cave is so frigid it hurts to inhale. The ambient air behaves like an active predator. It seeks out any exposed inch of skin, quietly leaching warmth from your extremities and dropping your core temperature degree by degree. You look toward the center of the cave, hoping for relief, but find the worst possible scenario. The central fire pit is completely dark. What was a roaring source of heat the night before is now nothing more than a cold mound of gray ash. Without immediate intervention, that pile of ash guarantees a grim outcome. Without a heat source to counteract the freezing air, hypothermia will shut down your organs before the sun hits the middle of the sky. But your ancestors knew exactly what to look for. If you carefully brush away that top insulating layer of gray ash, you'll find a single pulsing red coal preserved from the night before. This schematic of the thermal economy illustrates why fire is never a guarantee. It is a highly fragile chemical reaction. To coax that single ember back into a flame, you must manage a strict ratio of oxygen, perfectly sized kindling, and trapped heat. You place a meticulously prepared bundle of birch bark and dried grass over the coal. The diagram updates here to show the airflow dynamics. You apply a steady, highly controlled breath, providing enough oxygen to accelerate the reaction without blowing the fragile heat away. Within seconds, a flame erupts. Resurrecting that fire requires a passed-down, exacting science. Mastering this process was early humanity's primary defense against the freezing world. With the cave warming, the priority shifts from the fire pit to your own body. You step outside into knee-deep snow. The battle to maintain external heat is solved for now, but the battle to generate internal heat has just begun. Look at this comparative bar chart showing human caloric burn. A modern human resting in a heated room burns roughly 2,000 calories a day. An Ice Age human, simply standing in sub-freezing air and shivering to maintain their core temperature, burns through calories at a vastly accelerated rate. This creates a brutal biological paradox. To find the calories your body desperately needs to survive, you have to wade through deep snow and freezing air. As this energy ledger shows, the physical act of hunting burns the exact energy reserves you are trying to replenish, against a very low probability of actually catching anything. To offset this energy deficit, our ancestors aggressively targeted the most calorie-dense resources available. They tracked down thick animal fat, cracked open bones for rich marrow, and harvested highly concentrated wild honey. Every step through the snow, every swing of a tool, and every breath of freezing air cost precious energy. Living in this environment meant participating in a relentless, zero-sum caloric economy, where a single wasted trip could mean starvation. All that physical exertion in heavy winter gear introduces a highly counterintuitive threat. If you work hard enough to catch prey, your body heats up, and if you heat up, you sweat. This thermodynamic cross-section of human skin demonstrates the physics of why that moisture is so dangerous. Trapped sweat acts as a thermal bridge. It rapidly conducts heat away from your 98-degree body core directly into the freezing air, turning your warm clothing into an icy death trap. Paleolithic humans countered this by applying mixtures of animal fat and beeswax straight onto their exposed skin. This created an immediate, insulating, and water-resistant barrier against both the wind and their own perspiration. They also engineered highly sophisticated, moisture-managing clothing. This technical cutaway illustration of a Paleolithic boot reveals an outer shell of waterproofed leather, packed with inner layers of dry grasses. The grass provided heavy insulation while allowing trapped moisture to escape. Managing body moisture demanded the same intense focus as securing food. Miscalculate your layers and break a sweat miles from the cave, and you freeze to death long before you make it back. As the sun finally dips below the horizon, the daylight hunt ends. Long shadows stretch across the snow. The ambient temperature plummets to 40 below zero, and a deep psychological dread settles over the landscape. The community immediately shifts to their evening protocol. They bank the fire, deliberately packing a thick, carefully structured layer of ash over the hottest coals. This throttles the oxygen supply, ensuring the fuel burns slowly enough to last the entire night. They construct a body heat shelter. This overhead heat map illustrates the strategy. Positioning bodies tightly together maximizes shared radiant heat. Notice the thermal core. The youngest, who lose heat fastest, are placed in the absolute center, shielded by perimeter adults. Surviving a night at 40 below zero relied entirely on a community executing these precise, integrated thermal systems together. Inside the caves, harmlessly outside. Tomorrow, the fire must be rebuilt. The caloric arithmetic will reset, and the hunt will begin again. They sustained this 24-hour cycle of survival by passing down this strict environmental knowledge from generation to generation. Modern humanity exists because our ancestors solved the equations of fire, calories, and community. we carry the results of those successful calculations in our DNA. Get comfortable. Pull your blankets up close, take a slow, deep breath, and let your eyes drift shut. The Hollywood version of the golden age of piracy is a sun-drenched adventure of swashbuckling captains and open rebellion. But the moment you drop below the deck of an early 18th century vessel, that bright cinematic image completely evaporates. A stagnant, heavy wall of odor hits you first. It is an overwhelming mixture of hundreds of unwashed human bodies, damp, rotting timber, and trapped sweat with zero ventilation. Opening your eyes, you find yourself packed into a swinging, damp canvas hammock. Dozens of other men are suspended right next to you, shoulder to shoulder in the gloom. Every time the ship rolls with the waves, you bump into the person beside you. Personal space and privacy do not exist down here. Beneath bilge water sloshes constantly. Because rudimentary chamber buckets frequently spill in the dark, the water sitting in the belly of the ship is a fermenting stew of human waste, right beneath your sleeping body. Long before a pirate ever drew a sword or fired a cannon, they faced a daily psychological struggle against the profound physiological disgust of their own living quarters. When you drag yourself above deck for breakfast, you find a meal dictated by a single priority: preservation. Flavor and human nutrition were entirely irrelevant to survival at sea. This is a surviving historical artifact, shipboard hardtack. It's a simple biscuit baked until all moisture is gone. The handwritten notes on the brown paper mark this as a real surviving ration. The porous texture made it the perfect home for weevils and insect larvae. Eating required tapping the biscuit to knock out the maggots. To accompany this rock-hard bread, crews were issued heavily preserved pork and beef packed in coarse salt for months. The process stopped the meat from rotting, but it also stripped it of nearly all nutritional value. Surviving on this specific diet created a ticking biological clock inside every sailor. Without fresh produce, the human body is completely deprived of vitamin C, leading inevitably to scurvy. This medical illustration shows exactly how scurvy ravages a person. Focus on the upper leg depicted here. It starts with severe joint ache and these dark spotted lesions. Soon, your teeth loosen in your jaw, and these dark lesions begin to erupt across your skin. Looking at the lower leg illustrations, you can see the dark purple tissue necrosis of advanced stage scurvy. Vitamin C is required to maintain collagen. Without it, your body's connective tissues literally dissolve. Scars from old wounds suddenly tear open, leading to fatal internal bleeding. A pirate was more likely to be consumed by this slow, dietary predator than to ever be killed by a rival ship's cannonball. After forcing down your infested rations, the workday began. Maintaining a massive wooden sailing ship required grueling manual labor from sunrise until sunset, often continuing through the night. Your hours are spent hauling heavy, waterlogged hemp ropes and repairing massive canvas sails. There are no rest days and no protections for your spine. You work until your muscles break down. You do this entirely exposed to the elements. If it storms, you spend 12 hours shivering in freezing wet wool. If you're sailing the Caribbean, you suffocate in rough, chafing canvas under a blazing sun. Because fresh water is strictly rationed for drinking, bathing is a rare luxury. As a result, body and head lice infest every member of the crew, living and reproducing endlessly in the seams of your clothing. With slippery, rolling decks and heavy machinery, injuries are constant, and getting hurt introduces you to the terrifying reality of 18th century maritime medicine. Surgeons operated without any understanding of germ theory or sterilization. If a falling mast crushed your leg, the only treatment was an amputation performed with a dirty saw. Your only anesthesia was a cup of cheap rum and a leather strap clamped between your teeth. In this environment, even a minor cut from a splintered rail could lead to gangrene. Medical ignorance turned basic physical injuries into death sentences. When night falls and you crawl back into your damp hammock, the psychological stress of the ocean sets in. You are miles from land, wrapped in darkness, trying to sleep on a fragile wooden platform floating in an unforgiving sea. You lie awake listening to the wooden hull groan against the water, knowing a sudden storm could capsize the ship in minutes, or a naval patrol could emerge from the morning fog to hang the entire crew. The majority of men during the golden age of piracy died in their hammocks from waterborne illnesses like dysentery and cholera. Given the claustrophobia, disease, and rotting food, why did thousands of men willingly volunteer for this life? The choice reveals the alternatives back on land. For the average commoner, the option was either crushing, inescapable poverty or being forcibly kidnapped into the brutal discipline of the Royal Navy. Stepping onto a pirate ship was a calculated risk. Men tolerated these horrific conditions because it offered a fractional chance at freedom and wealth that didn't exist for them anywhere else. So as you lie there right now, sink a little deeper into your clean, soft mattress. Take a moment to appreciate the climate control, the fresh running water, and the safety of your modern walls. Tonight, unlike the men of the 18th century high seas, the only thing you have to surrender to is sleep.